I'm starting a Horus Heresy project. I've been slowly reading the books for about 6 months now, and I have an untouched Age of Darkness box set. And since I don't plan on playing the game anytime soon, I thought it'd be fun to do a trio of models to represent each of the legions. And what better place to start than the OG Luna Wolves? Now, most of the box is pretty basic Marines, and I thought it'd be fun to add a little something special just to elevate each of the groups. And what's more badass, what's more epic than putting on a cape? No, I know, I'm just saying though, if you already got power armor on, what the fuck do you need a cape for? Here. What the hell is this? Just put it on. Is this from your sofa, dude? Put it on. All right, jeez. You ready? Go. How fast is that? Wait, no, time me again. That was at least 4 seconds faster. Hey man, you got any jewelry on you?
I know how to hike up a volcano.
Yeah, do I look more intimidating? Xeno's filth.
That's what I thought.
Brothers, listen.
Dude, are you even billowing? Just billow. Billow harder. I'm sick of this.
Look, man, things just got a little out of hand. I know, but at least we established the capes make you feel a bit more important. Well. So, if you are looking for a way to add a little bit of presence to your miniatures, capes may be a great way to do that. Now, things may seem easy until you actually start trying to manipulate uncured putty, and you realize very quickly it doesn't always do exactly what you want it to do. Now, granted, there are some green stuff wizards out there that seem to be able to manipulate uncured putty in just the right way, get it to drape around their model, get all the folds in all the right places, and I've seen them use everything from toothpicks to cork to all sorts of warp spawn powers to keep it afloat and get it to be in that perfect position. But that was never me. So when I started to sculpt miniatures, I had to figure out a way to give myself a little bit more time to be able to study the folds and make sure that I got everything into the right place. And that's the method I'm going to be sharing with you in this video. So if you've tried sculpting capes in the past and you found the whole process to be too finicky or too frustrating, then I'm hoping that this method is going to be the strategy for you. Now, there is one crucial part of this process that you don't want to get wrong, and I even made the mistake in this video. So make sure to watch all the way to the end to avoid this caping catastrophe. You've been warned. Let's dive in. The first part of this process starts with polymer clay, and in this case I'm using Super Sculpey, just kneading it in my fingers to make it a little bit more malleable. Then we're gonna take our Marine and just super glue him to a base for the moment, and then we can take our polymer clay and start just kind of building up a mound of it at the back to act as a support for the cape that we are gonna create. Now, the main thing I'm doing here is making sure to work it all around the model, even kind of wrapping it around to the front a bit so that it can really grab on and make sure that it's not going to get detached as I start the sculpting process. So really what we're trying to establish at this stage is the borders of the cape, as well as the general movement of the folds, where we're going to have parts curving inwards and curving outwards. And honestly, you could probably leave it as simple as this cape. You don't really need to complicate it with smaller folds if you don't want to. These still look perfectly fine, but we are going to go a little bit further in this tutorial. And we also at this stage want to figure out how far away from the model the cape is going to project. So basically how much it's going to be blowing in the wind. All right, so I'm gonna start building up those folds just by adding some pieces of clay to the end here. And you can also trim stuff away from the bottom if you wanna stay conscious of the length of your cape. And keep in mind, this clay is fairly soft and malleable, so you may have to brace against it a little bit as you add these volumes. But you can see that I'm essentially creating 3 main sections where the cape kind of goes in and out. And then I'm using a loop tool here just to refine the surface a bit. These are really great for refining some concave shapes. Now, a quick tip with some of these kinds of clays, if you find them to be too soft, you can stick them into the freezer for about 20 minutes, and that's gonna firm them up, allowing you to cut and trim along the edges, as well as if you're gonna be adding new volumes over top of them, it's gonna prevent the surfaces underneath from shifting too much as you do that. Now I'm just cleaning up the area in the middle where it's going to drape, kind of creating a clear outline, and then just continuing to refine things a bit more before we get into putty, which of course is gonna be the magic sculpt that you know and love from all of our basing videos. Yes, it has great properties for sculpting as well, though when I use it for sculpting, I like to mix in a little bit of green stuff. And what this does is just make it a little bit more elastic, and that's gonna prevent it from tearing when you stretch it. Now I take usually about a quarter of the amount of green stuff compared to Magic Sculpt, though you can play around with these mixtures. The main thing is just to make sure that you mix it thoroughly, and then we can start rolling out a flat sheet for our cape. Now I'm using just a plastic baggie here to prevent it from sticking. I'm going to press it flat first, and I'm going to use 2 guides of equal thickness so that when I roll a round pin in between them, it's going to make sure that I get an even thickness throughout that whole piece. Then I'm going to take a quick measurement with my calipers to figure out the width of the shoulders. And then to cut this, I'm just going to be using a razor blade, which I'm going to dip into the water to help it slide through the putty a little bit more easily. So just applying gentle pressure and pushing it all the way through. I'm going to take another quick measurement. And again, I'm also going to make sure that I leave it a little bit wider towards the bottom so that it can sort of billow outwards. And then I'm just going to take a knife and gently pull away the cut pieces. And you can see that water really helps this process and helps it to detach from the baggie. Now sometimes I like to coat the putty in baby powder before I roll it out, which will make it lift off from the bag even easier, but I find it's usually pretty fine without it too. And the thing I don't like about the powder is it's going to make it less likely to stick to additional putty that you put on top of it. At least if you're impatient like me and can't wait for the whole thing to cure before continuing to sculpt on it. So now we're just fitting this on top of our polymer clay base, and I'm using just some sculpting tools like this clay shaper here to mold it to those underlying forms, gently pressing it in and making sure that it takes the shape underneath. And now we have a base layer of epoxy putty, which we're going to be able to peel off from our supporting structure once it cures. When we're looking at a cape like this, things can seem a bit confusing because it looks like there's a lot of folds going on and it's not really clear where they're all coming from. But if we think about breaking it down into 3 separate parts, like this, then you can see that on either side here we have a tension point that is coming from the shoulder, and then in between here we have the fabric kind of being suspended between those 2 points. So we're going to get more linear pipe folds going through from the shoulder area and emanating down this way. So basically all these originate from that shoulder point. And then in between here is where we're going to get these U-shaped folds that are suspended in between them. And now the higher up that you go, the more that these U-shapes are going to be complete. And then as you kind of taper off towards the bottom portion, you're going to see that they're going to become incomplete and they sort of start to weave in and out of each other. Now, obviously you could go for a lot less folds in this and make a lot less complicated of a cape. As long as you get the structure right though, it should be pretty solid. So let's jump back in and start laying down some rolls of putty and begin sculpting those U-folds in that middle section. And you may notice that the putty at this point, if you're using the same batch that you mixed earlier, is probably starting to get quite firm. And if it starts getting too hard to manipulate, you may want to mix a new fresh batch. And what that's going to allow you to do is use the firmer putty underneath as sort of your scaffolding. It's going to be the part that lets you block in the major volumes, and then you can use the softer putty on top to fill in any gaps, to start working in some of the finer details, because it's going to be a lot more malleable. And the reason this is advantageous is because having the firmer putty underneath is going to prevent those volumes from shifting as you add details on top. Now I'm using a little sliver of the sheet we rolled out previously to create an overlapping fold here in the middle. And I think that really helps to emphasize the depth of that initial fold. Now at this point I had let it sit for quite a while so the putty was able to cure. Usually Magic Sculpt will fully cure within about 24 hours. Though even after a couple hours, it's usually fine to handle. Just give it a quick poke to make sure that it's not too malleable still. And then you can just gently start wiggling it back and forth until it comes loose from that sculpty layer. And the nice thing about this is you can see that we actually get the negative of that cape on the other side too. And now it's time for a little bit of cleanup. So in the previous stage, it was hard to get a sharp edge to the cape because it was still soft and malleable. But now that it's cured, I can use my Dremel tool to grind away and give myself a sharp edge and border to the cape. Now, I do recommend doing this outside if you can, unless you want to get dust all over your workspace, which is not so much fun. I've also got some smaller Dremel heads which I'll use to clean up those inner folds, as well as some files which can help with some additional smoothing, and of course sandpaper, which will help you to refine the middle volumes. Now, after you do that, give this a good wash just to make sure you get rid of all that dust, because it's gonna make it harder for the putty to stick on afterwards. And we still have some refinement left to go, so I'm gonna reattach the cape to my base layer and continue working those folds. You can also create a paste with the Magic Sculpt by just mixing it with some water and then paint that onto the surface of the cape. And this is just gonna help to fill in some of those scratches left by the sandpaper. And since we're almost done with the main sculpting on the cape, I decided I would start to remove the underlayer of the polymer clay, and it really got in there, so I had to spend quite a bit of time trying to peel it off. And then I realized I f***ed up. All this gunk on the model was not coming off, and what had happened is that the polymer actually melted the plastic underneath. And this was not fun to clean up. I probably spent like an hour just scraping away at the surface and trying to clean it up. And this reaction is due to plasticizers found in the polymer clay, which will react and dissolve certain plastics that they come into contact with. So I tested this on some random bits of sprue and left it for a couple of days just to see the impacts. And you can see that the original Sculpey has kind of a mild melting effect, whereas this gray one had a much more aggressive one. So this is just a good reminder to make sure that you test your polymers before committing to this process, unless you want to end up in a sticky situation. Now, I've done this several times in the past with Super Sculpey and had no issues because, again, it depends on the composition of the polymer as well as the plastic. So I tried to find a way around it by putting some plastic wrap in between the polymer clay and the sprue, and it looks like in that middle part where I applied it, there was no dissolving going on. So I tried it on the model, wrapping the whole thing in plastic and then building up the cape. Just make sure to press it on there firmly because the plastic wrap will make it slip a little bit more, but other than that, it was fine and no issues with melting on the model afterwards. So for your own safety, kids, make sure to wrap it up. Now for our last stage of refinements, I noticed that the cape was still a bit too long, so I'm gonna take my Dremel again and just trim it down some more. And then we can go into another round of sanding, and for this I'm using a fine grit wet and dry sandpaper. So I'm going to take a couple drops of water on the surface and then begin sanding. And trust me, you can spend a lot of time sanding, and you may need to switch back and forth from using the fine grit to the coarser grit, and repeat that process as many times as necessary until you are satisfied with the result. Now for the finishing touches, I wanted to put some rips and tears into this cape just to make it feel more rugged. So I just drew these on with a marker to map them out, and then I went in with my Dremel tool to start carving things out. Now you could use these disc-shaped Dremel heads to make some of these initial rips, and then I went in with a fine drill to put some holes into the middle of the cape, which I then went and cleaned up with a sharp knife, just to make some of those edges more crisp. Now, I'm pretty happy with where the cape was at this point, so I decided it's time to actually attach it to our model. Of course, we now don't have anything underneath, so it's gonna have to stick on there. So I've basically gone and glued it to the shoulders, and now I'm gonna take some smaller bits of putty here just to sculpt the details that are gonna connect it to those shoulder pads. Then we're going to need to sculpt some bunching folds there, and also make sure that we connect the edges of the existing cape to the part that's going over the shoulder, and then you can just blend that together with some water. And once that cures, we are all done, and we have a much more epic sergeant to lead our troops into battle. All right, now I will admit part of me was kind of dreading this process because I hadn't done it in such a long time, but honestly it was actually kind of fun. Now, the one thing that I'm not super pleased with is just the overall movement in the cape. I feel like it's just going a little too much straight backwards, and had I planned it out better, I think I would have kind of curved it out to the side a little bit more, just made it fit the pose of the model. Now, this highlights one of the key differences between sculpting traditionally and sculpting in a 3D program like ZBrush, where in 3D you get to make little tweaks and adjustments far later in the process just by using something like the Move brush. But in Putty, once you're locked into that first layer, you're kind of locked in. But still, overall, I think it turned out quite nice, and I think it's gonna get me the look that I'm going for with these Luna Wolves. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. I hope that makes you feel a little bit more confident about sculpting capes. And if you like this type of content, then please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so that we can continue to bring you more of this type of stuff in the future. All right, until next time, my friends, go make it epic.
automatic exit.